Hey there. Welcome to Dark Lullabies. How was your day? I'm so glad you're here, and I really hope I can help you relax and find some peace tonight. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Okay, let's get started with the first story. Story 1. It was the spring of 2020 inches. The Appalachian Mountains right after everything shut down, when the highways went empty and the only people you saw on the road were truckers and the occasional worn-out local in a rusted pickup. And while everyone else was baking bread and learning how to work from their kitchen tables, I was using the pandemic as an excuse to disappear into the hills. A year earlier, I'd blown the whistle on something at the small investment firm where I worked in Charlotte, thinking I was doing the right thing. But it backfired in a way I never imagined. One wrong move with a file, one badly handled email chain, and suddenly I was the guy whose mistake cost a handful of loud, angry people a lot of money. My name made the rounds in a couple of local articles. Clients called me a thief, my boss called me a liability, and within a few months I'd had to move apartments, change my number, wipe my social media, and walk away from the career I thought I'd build my whole life around. For a while, my phone lit up day and night with unknown numbers, some just calling and hanging up, some sending messages that started off as insults and escalated into detailed threats. There was one guy who knew the color of my old car, another who referenced the street I used to live on. I never figured out if it was a group of people piling on or one obsessive person cycling through burner numbers, but it felt like the internet had condensed into a single faceless presence that hated me. Then, slowly, it went quiet. Weeks went by with only my parents and my sister checking in. The threats stopped. I told myself people had moved on to the next story. Still, I couldn't sleep, couldn't focus, and the boredom of lockdown only made my own mistakes louder in my head. So I packed up my old Tacoma, bought a cheap 9mm pistol I barely knew how to use, and pointed the truck toward a stretch of national forest off the Blue Ridge Parkway in western North Carolina. A place where the mountains fold into themselves and the hollows hold on to the mist long after the sun comes up. The first unsettling thing happened before I ever left pavement. I turned off the main road onto a narrow two-lane that wound past sagging trailers and abandoned gas stations. The kind of road where you see kids' bikes lying in yards, but no people. Just curtains shifting. A gray sedan slipped in behind me, dirty enough that I couldn't read the plate. At first, I didn't think anything of it. There aren't many options up there. But mile after mile, every time I slowed, it slowed. When I took the right turn onto the gravel forest road that wasn't marked on any tourist map, the gray car turned too. The road got rough. Potholes of old red clay and ruts from logging trucks, and I finally pulled off into a wider patch to let the car go around. Instead, it stopped about 30 yards back. The windows were too tinted to see anyone. We sat there, engines idling, in a silence so thick I could hear my own pulse. I waited. After what felt like forever, the sedan eased backward, turning in a slow, careful arc, then headed back the way we'd come, never passing me. It didn't feel like a coincidence. I told myself it was just a local who'd thought better of following an out-of-state plate into the woods. But as I kept driving, the image of those black windows burned into the back of my brain. By the time I reached the dead end where the road turned into a faint trail, I'd convinced myself I was being paranoid. The air was colder up there than it had any right to be in March, the ground patched with thin, crusty snow that popped and crunched with every step. I shouldered my pack and followed the trail along a narrow creek that braided through moss-covered rocks and rhododendron thickets, the sound of the water echoing off the steep walls of the hollow. There was no one else around, no voices, no distant cars, no planes crossing overhead, just the water and the occasional crow. It was exactly the kind of silence I thought I wanted. When I found a flat spot above a bend in the creek, tucked between two hemlocks, I dropped my pack and started to set up camp. That's when I noticed the second thing that didn't fit. On the far side of the little clearing, near a half-rotten log, was an old fire ring I hadn't seen on the satellite map, just a circle of stones with a blackened center. Stuck in the ash was the twisted, partly melted filter of a cigarette, the paper still white near the tip like it hadn't been there long, like whoever smoked it hadn't bothered to grind it out properly. I don't smoke, and the snow around it was only lightly disturbed. A lopsided boot print smeared near the ring, not mine. No fresh tracks leading in or out, just that one half print, like someone had been standing right there, watching the same spot I'd just chosen. I felt a little prickle run down my neck, but told myself it was just a hunter's campsite, nothing more. I pitched the tent, gathered wood, and forced my brain back into its old routines. Cut, stack, light, feed. As the light started to thin between the trees, the fire caught and began to throw real heat. I cooked a couple of sausages in a pan, listened to the creek, and for the first time in months felt my chest loosen. The world beyond that hollow barely existed. When the sky turned from dull blue to the inky, starless black you only get in the mountains on an overcast night, I pulled on my headlamp and rolled a joint. Weed was one of the only things that quieted the looping soundtrack of what-ifs and should-haves in my head. And out there, with no one to judge me, it felt like a small act of mercy. A few hits in, everything softened at the edges. The fire was a little warmer, the creek a little louder, the trees a little taller. I was sinking into that warmth when my phone buzzed in my jacket pocket. It startled me because no one texts me like that anymore. My circle had shrunk to about 3 people, and they usually called. When I pulled the phone out and saw a cluster of messages from an unfamiliar number, my high curdled into something sharp. The area code was 203 Connecticut. I live in North Carolina, grew up in Georgia. I don't know a single person from Connecticut. The first message said something like, "How's that little campsite in the hollow?" Another popped up a second later, talking about how beautiful the creek sounded from up here. The third said they could see why it'd come back up alone. If it had just said, "How's camping?" I might have convinced myself it was my sister messing with me from her boyfriend's phone. But the way the messages were phrased, it felt like someone was standing just out of sight, commenting on my night in real time. The buzz from the weed turned on me, magnifying every possible threat. My heart started hammering in my throat. The hemlocks that had seemed peaceful a minute earlier now watched me like a crowd. I stood up and turned in a slow, clumsy circle, my headlamp cutting through the dark in jerky sweeps. But all I saw were trunks and branches and the fog of my own breath. My stomach dropped in a too familiar way. It was the same mix of shame and fear it felt when those first hate texts came in a year earlier. Back then it'd been powerless, hiding in a one-bedroom apartment while strangers described, in creative detail, what they'd like to do to me. Now I was a 2-hour drive from the nearest city, and my only defense was the handgun zipped into my pack. I'd bought it more out of anxiety than anything else, telling myself I'd learn how to shoot once things calmed down. They never did. With shaking hands, I dug it out, checked the magazine like I'd seen in videos, and kept it within reach. The fire was burning low, the edges of camp bleeding into darkness. Normally, I'd have doused it before bed, but the idea of being swallowed by total black made my skin crawl. So I fed it a couple more logs and retreated into the tent with my phone and the gun. I tried to distract myself, propping my headlamp in a corner and picking up the book I'd brought, but my eyes skated off the words. I ended up opening YouTube and letting a true crime documentary play, the narrator's calm voice filling the space between the snaps and pops of the fire outside. Watching a story about victims in remote places while I was a victim in a remote place probably wasn't my smartest move, but fear doesn't always make room for logic. At some point, my phone buzzed again. The unknown number had responded to my shaky, "Who is this?" with a line that basically said it didn't matter anymore. It sounded final in a way that made my palms sweat. I asked how they knew I was camping and stared at the screen, waiting. But nothing came back. Minutes dragged. Outside, the flames slumped to orange embers, and the sound of the creek seemed to recede, leaving a kind of vacuum where every crack of a twig was too loud. Appalachian woods in winter are so quiet it almost hurts. No insects, no leaves, just the occasional gust of wind slipping through bare branches. When the video on my phone ended, the silence slammed into me. Then came the third thing. At first it was faint, a rhythmic crunch in the snow and frozen leaves, too steady to be a deer. It grew louder, closer. deliberate, human. Whoever it was stopped just a few feet from the thin nylon wall that separated us. My hand clenched around the pistol so hard my knuckles hurt. There was a pause, the kind that stretches time, and then a white flash lit up the tent from outside, not bright enough to be lightning, more like someone had raised a phone or a small flashlight and snapped a photo. My lungs forgot how to work. The footsteps started again. Slower now, moving away through the trees. I forced myself not to unzip the tent, not to call out. Just as the sound was fading, my phone chimed. A photo slid into view from the unknown number. It was my tent, framed by the dark trunks of the hemlocks, the glow of the dying fire painting one side orange. It was taken from maybe 10 feet away, at a slight angle, like the person was half hiding behind a tree. A second image arrived a moment later, and this one made something deep in me go cold. It was me from earlier that afternoon, standing on the rocks by the creek, head tilted back, eyes closed, hands on my hips. I hadn't seen anyone when that was taken. Whoever had sent it had been following me long before sunset, close enough to photograph me, quiet enough that I never noticed. That was my third new horror. The realization that I hadn't just attracted danger. It'd been carrying it with me up the trail like a shadow. Something inside me snapped back into focus. The leftover haze from the joint burned away in a rush of adrenaline. I unzipped the tent in one quick motion, stepped out into the freezing air in my socks, and fired 2 shots straight up. The sound ripped through the hollow and bounced off the ridges, louder than any bang it heard in my life, so violent that my ears rang. In the split second after, I heard the frantic scramble of boots on snow and loose rock, crashing through underbrush. Whoever it was had been closer than I wanted to believe. Maybe just beyond the ring of my campfire an hour earlier. Maybe watching the tent from the dark as I scrolled my phone. I yelled something I barely remember, threats, curses, a promise that I wasn't as helpless as I looked, and stood there shaking, waiting for a return shot that never came. The woods settled back into a suffocating quiet. No more footsteps, no more flashes, no more messages. Back inside the tent, my hands wouldn't stop trembling, and my mind replayed every second of the last year. The voicemail that called me a thief, the anonymous commenter who said they hoped I died slowly, the coworker who'd forwarded my parents a link to an article that made it sound like I'd tanked people's retirements single-handedly. I had no proof that any of those people had tracked me to that hollow. But lying there with my heart trying to beat out of my chest, it seemed entirely possible that one of them had decided an empty national forest in the middle of a pandemic was the perfect place to even the score. Sleep came in fractured pieces. Every time I started to drift off, my brain yanked me back to the sound of those footsteps and the way the tent had glowed in that stolen photo. At some point, I must have passed out anyway, because the next thing I remember is the thin light of morning pressing through the nylon. When I stepped outside, the first thing I saw was the pattern of tracks around my camp. My own boots, looping from the tent to the fire and down toward the creek. And a second set, larger and deeper, pacing the perimeter in a loose circle where the light wouldn't reach, coming close and then retreating, over and over. Near the old fire ring with a cigarette butt, someone had wedged a small stick into the ground and tied to it, with clumsy knots, a scrap of orange surveyor's tape like the kind road crews use. My name was written on it in black marker, first and last, the ink slightly blurred from the cold. It was the final piece I needed to understand that whoever had been there hadn't stumbled across me by accident. They'd come for me. I didn't take pictures. I ripped the tape off the stick, stuffed it in my pocket with shaking fingers, kicked snow over the ring, and broke camp in record time. Heart hammering the whole way as if the gray sedan from the day before might roll silently back up that gravel road. No one followed me out, and my phone stayed silent. In the 5 years since that night, I haven't heard from that Connecticut number again. No calls, no texts, no comments on the few accounts I've dared to rebuild. Part of me is grateful. Another part hates the unfinishedness of it. The way danger can step into your life, mark you, and then walk away without explanation. I still love the mountains, but I haven't camped alone in Appalachia since. When I think back on that night, the gray car, The fresh cigarette in a forgotten fire ring, the pictures taken without my knowledge, my name written on a scrap of tape in the middle of nowhere. It's not ghosts or monsters that haunt me. It's the simple, terrible fact that a real, breathing person decided to follow me into a dark hollow and see what would happen. If you were in my place that night, would you have stayed after firing those shots? Or would you have hiked out in the dark and trusted the mountains to let you go? Tell me in the comments, because sometimes I still wonder if I was brave, stupid, or just too frozen in fear to make any other choice. Story 2. When I think back on the night I stopped loving the dark, my mind always goes to my uncle's place in the Appalachians. A little slice of steep hillside and hardwood forest in eastern Tennessee that felt like its own small world when I was a kid. Every October, my whole family would pile into cars and drive up from the suburbs to spend a long weekend there. My Uncle Ray owned about 4 acres on the side of a ridge, with an old, creaky house that somehow fit everyone. 5 bedrooms jammed with mismatched beds and bunk beds, 3 small bathrooms that constantly had a line, and a wide front porch that looked out over the tops of the trees. 2 of the bedrooms were for us kids, 1 for me, my younger brother Luke, and our boy cousins Caleb and Noah, and 1 for our girl cousins Hannah and Grace, and my sister Emily. The adults took the rest of the rooms like some chaotic, rotating timeshare. Uncle Ray was one of those Appalachian guys who seemed born with a rifle over his shoulder and a fishing rod in his hand. He hunted every season he could, from deer to turkey, and he'd disappear for days into national forest land like it was nothing, coming back with game, stories, and clothes that smelled like smoke and rain. My dad was the opposite gentle to a fault, a guy who would swerve his car to avoid a squirrel, but when he and Uncle Ray were together, especially with a little whiskey in them, they turned into teenagers again, laughing too loud, daring each other to do dumb things, and treating us boys like their personal audience. Behind the house, Uncle Ray's land sloped down into thick woods, and at the back had painted red stripes on certain trees to mark where his property ended and public land began. He told us the ridge kept going for miles, that beyond his markers there were no houses, just old logging roads, bear trails, and the occasional hunter. I remember standing at that invisible line as a kid and feeling like I was staring into a deeper kind of wilderness than I understood, a place that didn't care if I was brave or scared. One Saturday at lunch, when I was about 13 and Luke and Caleb were 10 and Noah was 9, our dads started talking hunting stories at the table near Mrs. Weird sounds in the trees, the comfort of sleeping under canvas after a long day of dragging a deer. Somewhere in that mix, the idea came up that we should camp in the woods that night, just us boys. Maybe it was my suggestion, maybe Caleb's. In my memory, it just appears suddenly like it had been waiting in the room for someone to say it out loud. To our surprise, both Dad and Uncle Ray said yes almost immediately, grinning that tipsy, reckless grin they got when they had a buzz on. Our moms pushed back. They said we were too young to be out there alone, that there were coyotes and black bears and God knew what else in those hills. But the dads waved it off, promising we'd be close and that they'd hear us if anything tried to eat us. It was meant as a joke and got a few laughs, but I remember a knot of unease settling low in my stomach even then, like some part of me knew this wasn't going to end as a fun story. That afternoon, Dad and Uncle Ray hauled a big, family-sized tent and a pile of gear out of the basement and led us into the woods. We followed them past the familiar backyard tree line, down a narrow deer path, and eventually beyond the red-marked trees that meant we were technically off Uncle Ray's land. The air felt cooler there, heavier somehow. The first strange thing I noticed was on a beech tree, just beyond the property line. Deep, vertical grooves clawed into the bark about as high as my chest. Not the shallow scratching you'd expect from a bored kid, but 4 ugly, parallel rakes that had pulled the outer bark clean off. Hanging from a nail above the scratches was a rusty length of chain, the end looping in a way that made my skin crawl, like it had once been attached to something that fought to be free. Uncle Ray just glanced at it and kept walking, but I slowed down, staring. It didn't look fresh, but it didn't look old either, not grown over or smoothed out by time. I told myself it was a bear marking a tree and some leftover farm junk and forced my feet to move. Eventually, we came to a small clearing tucked into a fold of the ridge. a soft carpet of green moss and leaf litter underfoot. Uncle Ray called it a deer bed, saying he'd seen does lying out there at dawn, and declared it the perfect campsite. He and my dad gave us a half-serious lesson on how to pitch the tent, making us hold poles and feed them through sleeves instead of doing it themselves. The tent felt huge when it was finally standing, roomy enough for the four of us and our gear. We rolled out our sleeping bags, tossed in extra blankets, and set our flashlights in a pile in the center like a small constellation. As we were about to head back to the house for dinner, I noticed a boot print just off the clearing, pressed into a patch of damp, dark soil near a rotting log. It was much larger than any of ours and pointed straight toward the tent, the edges crisp like it hadn't been there long. There were no other tracks leading to or away from it that I could see, just the solitary impression of someone's weight. I mentioned it, but my dad shrugged, saying it was probably his or Ray's from another trip. I wanted to believe that, so I did, or at least pretended to. Back at the house, we played football in the yard until the sun started to slide behind the ridge and the smell of chili drifted out from the kitchen. At dinner, the moms raised their concerns again, saying it would be cold, that we'd get scared, that the woods sounded different at night, but the dads brushed them off, repeating the joke about hearing our screams and acting like that was a guarantee of safety instead of a sentence you'd regret forever. After dark, Dad and Uncle Ray walked us back into the woods with our flashlights, extra blankets, and a battered deck of Uno cards I insisted on bringing. By then, the forest had changed. The cheerful glow of the house was gone, replaced by thick pockets of shadow where our flashlights seemed to get swallowed up before they reached the trunks of the trees. The ground, soft and familiar by day, felt like it hid holes and roots just waiting to twist an ankle. The air smelled like cold dirt and decaying leaves. I remember glancing over my shoulder as the house disappeared behind us, already wishing I could see its porch light. When we reached the tent, Dad and Uncle Ray helped us get settled, then turned around and left with a few parting jokes, their flashlight beams bobbing away through the undergrowth until they vanished. Suddenly it was just us. 4 boys in a thin nylon bubble, surrounded by a forest that felt much bigger now that there was no adult silhouette near the entrance. We spread out in the tent, arranged the flashlights in a circle, and started playing Uno to kill time. For a while, it worked. The cards and the competition gave our hands and mouths something to do, and the laughter softened the strangeness of being out there. My brothers and cousins forgot to be nervous. I pretended I had too. Maybe half an hour in, just as I was stacking another win, a sound cut through the tent's thin walls, the distant scream of what sounded, unmistakably, like a girl. It was faint, somewhere out in the trees, long and sharp, not a whoop or a laugh, but a full-bodied, terrified scream. All 4 of us froze. We stared at each other, our faces washed pale in flashlight glow. My first instinct was to say it was a fox. I'd heard once that red foxes can scream like women, and clinging to that explanation felt safer than imagining a real girl lost or hurt out there. I said as much, and I could see some of the tension drain from Noah's shoulders, see Luke trying to convince himself it was true. We went back to the game, a little quieter now, ears tuned to the dark, forcing ourselves to believe in foxes. The second scream came later, closer. It cut through our nervous chatter like a knife, louder this time, as if whatever made it had stepped several hundred yards nearer. The sound had more weight now, less like an animal calling and more like a person in real trouble. We didn't try to explain it away. The temperature in that tent seemed to drop 10 degrees in an instant. I told everyone to turn off their flashlights. In the dark, our breathing sounded too loud, too fast. None of us wanted to make a run for the house. There's a special kind of fear that comes with imagining yourself sprinting through black woods, convinced something is chasing you, your own footsteps betraying you with every stride. Hiding in the tent, flimsy as it was, felt like the safer choice, at least for a little while. We crawled into our sleeping bags and huddled there, whispering. At some point, a new sound slipped in under the wind and the rustle of dry leaves. A slow, almost thoughtful whistling from somewhere out among the trees. It wasn't a tune I recognized, not a song, just 3 descending notes repeated over and over. It would go on for a minute, pause, then start again from a different direction, like someone was moving around us, seeing how close they could get without being seen. Every time one of us whispered a little too loudly, the whistling would stop, and the silence that followed felt even worse, thick and waiting. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. That was the second truly wrong thing that night. The moment when I stopped believing this was animals and started wondering who else was in those woods and why they cared that we were there. I told my cousins the whistling was probably some kind of bird, but I didn't believe myself anymore, and I don't think they did either. I don't know which one of us heard it first, but we all jerked upright at the same moment when the sound of fast footsteps tearing through leaves rushed toward the tent. They were heavy enough to send small vibrations through the ground. Then they stopped right outside the thin nylon wall. What followed is burned into my memory. A scream so close and so loud it felt like it originated inside my chest instead of outside the tent, high-pitched like a woman's, but twisted by something raw and ugly in the throat. As the scream tore through us, hands, or at least that's what it felt like, grabbed hold of the fabric and shook the tent violently from multiple sides. The walls buckled inward, the ceiling bowed, and our world became a collapsing, thrashing cocoon. All four of us started screaming, our voices cracked and childish and useless against whatever was out there. Noah and Caleb screamed wordless terror. Luke's voice tried to sound brave but broke. Mine bounced between yelling for it to stop and urging everyone to get out. In the chaos, I felt the tent floor dip sharply in one corner, like one of the stakes had been yanked loose from outside. For a second, cold air knifed in under the edge of the tent, brushing against my ankles, raw and real, and I had the sickening sensation that someone was trying to peel the structure open from beneath, like lifting the corner of a blanket to see what squirmed underneath. That was the third horror, knowing it wasn't just shaking, it was probing, trying to access the small space where we thought we were hidden. Survival instinct finally overruled paralysis. I fumbled for the zipper at the door, hands clumsy and weak, and yanked it up. One by one, we scrambled out into the night. Flashlights flicked on with trembling hands. The beam from my light cut through the dark in jerky arcs as we bolted through the trees, tripping over roots, crashing through underbrush, screaming for our parents at the top of our lungs. Every snapped twig behind us sounded like pursuit. Every gust of wind felt like a hand at our backs. The run back to the house felt like it lasted an hour, even though it was probably only a couple of minutes. When we broke through the last line of trees into the yard, the porch light was already on, and our entire family was spilling out of the house, faces pale and startled. We collided with them in a tangle of arms and questions and shaking limbs. We tried to explain what had happened, the screams, the whistling, the tent shaking, the tug at the ground, and for once the adults didn't smile or roll their eyes. There was a look that passed between my dad and Uncle Ray that I didn't understand then. Something like fear and guilt sharing space. I remember frantically scanning the crowd for my sister and girl cousins, half convinced they'd been roped into some elaborate prank, but they were already in pajamas, eyes wide and confused, clearly as out of the loop as we were. That was the fourth wrong thing, the one that made everything else snap into focus, the realization that whoever had come to our tent, it wasn't family. Dad and Uncle Ray grabbed rifles and flashlights and disappeared into the woods together, leaving the rest of us on the porch in a tight, silent huddle. Time dragged. Every minute they were gone, my mind filled in worse and worse possibilities. When they finally came back, they said they hadn't found anything, no person, no animal, nothing that explained the screams or the shaking. But years later, when I replay that night, there's one more detail I can't shake. One I didn't notice until the next day when we all trudged back down to the clearing to take the tent apart. Just beyond where Wed pitched it, half hidden behind a screen of young saplings, was a rough little structure made of branches and tarp scraps, like a makeshift blind. Inside were a couple of crushed beer cans, a torn pack of cigarettes, and a flattened spot on the ground where someone had clearly sat more than once. From that angle, you could see our tent perfectly through the trees. It wasn't old. The tarps were barely faded, the cans hadn't rusted, and the cigarette pack was a brand my uncle didn't smoke. It was the fifth and final piece of the horror. and maybe the one that haunts me most. The idea that whoever screamed and shook that tent might not have been passing through the woods at random. They might have been using that hillside long before we showed up, watching deer, or hikers, or kids who thought the world couldn't touch them if the grown-ups were only a few hundred yards away. We carried the tent and blankets back to the house that afternoon and never camped in those woods again. After dark, none of us even wanted to play in the yard. The tree line had changed from an invitation to a warning. As an adult, I've spent a lot of time trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was a drunk hunter who thought scaring kids was funny. Maybe some local had set up that blind to watch game and lost his mind for a night. There's no ghost story here, no monster. Just the reality that a human being chose to stand outside a tent full of children, scream like a woman in pain, shake their shelter to the point of collapse, and then vanish back into the woods. That, to me, is scarier than anything supernatural. I still go hiking in the Appalachians sometimes, but I've never again lain in a tent and truly relaxed. Not when the wind shifts or a branch snaps in the dark. If you'd heard those screams and felt those hands on the tent, do you think you would ever camp in the woods again or let your own kids sleep out of sight of the house? Tell me in the comments what you think was really out there that night. Because after all these years, I still don't have an answer that lets me sleep easy. Story 3. What I'm about to tell you happened in the Appalachian Mountains of Western Virginia, and even now, years later, when I let myself really think about it, I feel that same tightness in my chest I felt that night, like the ridge itself is leaning in toward me again. And I know how it sounds if I were hearing this from someone else. It'd probably question parts of it too, but I keep coming back to the same unnerving thing. My dad and I lived through it together, and our memories line up in all the ways that matter. It was 2 summers before everything shut down, and back then, one of the ways my dad and I stayed close was by taking short camping trips to state parks along the Blue Ridge. We both lived in different cities by then, and those weekends gave us an excuse to forget about work, bills, and whatever else we didn't want to talk about. This place in particular was a small campground tucked into a narrow valley, ringed by tree-covered slopes and crisscrossed with hiking trails and a zip-line course left over from some ecotourism boom. It had that mix you see a lot in Appalachia. Families in shiny RVs, grilling hot dogs right next to rusted-out old pickups and tents that had clearly seen 30 years of use. There was also a certain heaviness hanging over it, like a history you could feel but not quite name. In the main office, where we checked in, there was a faded poster about the area's indigenous history, a glass case full of arrowheads, and a corkboard cluttered with local flyers. That corkboard was the first thing that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Tucked between advertisements for firewood and a church bake sale were 2 missing person flyers for hikers who'd vanished in the surrounding national forest. One of them was a solo camper who had last been seen near the Upper River Loop, which was exactly where our reserved site was. There was a yellowed note pinned under his flyer, handwritten, asking anyone who might have seen a blue backpack or a pair of broken trekking poles to contact the sheriff. It looked old, maybe a year or 2, and clearly no one had taken it down. I remember looking at my dad, expecting him to suggest we pick a different park, but he just gave me that calm, half-smiling look he always gives when he's trying to steady both of us, and we went ahead and checked in. The first night was almost perfect. Every site was full. Kids were racing up and down the gravel loops on bikes with little plastic streamers on the handlebars. Someone a few rows over was playing classic rock on a Bluetooth speaker, and the whole valley glowed with campfires and cheap string lights. We grilled hot dogs, burned our marshmallows, traded stories with the family in the next site over, and fell asleep to a warm hum of laughter and crackling wood. The river a short walk away provided a steady, soothing background noise, like a big fan somewhere just out of view. And I remember thinking how easy it was to breathe there, how different the air felt from my cramped second-floor apartment back in the city. The second day, though, the park emptied out. A storm had been in the forecast, and most people decided not to risk another night. By late afternoon, as Dad and I sat on boulders along the river listening to a true crime podcast through a little speaker because, of course, we thought that was fun, we realized we weren't hearing any other human voices. No car doors slamming. No kids' arguments over s'mores. When we hiked back up toward the office to charge our phones, the woman at the desk confirmed it. A last-minute cancellation had left us as the only registered campers in the park. She said it with a kind of cheerful shrug, like it was a neat bit of trivia. But as we walked back down the gravel to our site, with our phones plugged into portable battery packs, the silence felt different. The valley didn't hum anymore. It held its breath. On the way, we passed the empty upper loop, and that's where we hit our second uneasy detail of the day. Near an unused tent pad at the far end, right where the slope of the ridge begins to rise sharply, we saw a set of deep drag marks in the dirt, leading from the tree line to the gravel road and then stopping abruptly, like something heavy had been pulled from the woods and into the open, then hoisted up into a truck. The grooves were parallel, as if from two long objects or a big tarp, and pressed so deeply into the earth that it must have taken serious weight to make them. At the base of a nearby oak, there were fresh hatchet marks, the pale wood staring out from beneath torn bark. And above them, nailed too high for a kid to reach, was a crude bundle of sticks tied with dirty orange twine. It looked almost like a charm someone might hang in a horror movie. But up close you could see it was just snapped branches and twine. Nothing mystical still. The intent behind it felt wrong, like someone had wanted to mark that spot and didn't care who noticed. My dad said maybe the park staff had been clearing brush or hauling logs, and I tried to nod like that explanation checked out. But as we left that loop and returned to our own site, I kept glancing back toward those drag marks, thinking about the missing hiker flyer and the blue backpack no one had ever found. By sunset, a low ceiling of clouds had rolled in, pressing down on the valley and turning the trees into a dark, indistinct wall. We cooked a simple dinner, shared a couple of beers around the fire, and did our best to joke about things. Old camping mishaps, my dad's first attempt at backpacking when he forgot to pack any socks. Memory after memory trying to pin this night down is just another story in our long line of stories. But the longer the fire burned, the stranger the air felt. It was heavy and oddly still, like we were underwater. The birds shut up earlier than they should have. The river, which had sounded cheerful the night before, now sounded distant, muffled, as if someone had turned the volume down on it. At one point, right as dusk tipped into full dark, we noticed a light moving far up on the slope across from us at first. Just a small, steady glow threading between trees, then stopping to hover in one spot. It was too bright to be a firefly, and too steady to be a phone screen. It could have been a headlamp, someone hiking illegally off-trail, or maybe a poacher with a flashlight. But what made it worse was that the light clearly changed direction once or twice, then snapped off abruptly the moment my dad's flashlight beam swept across the ridge. Right after it died, a faint chemical smell drifted down, sharp and acrid, like solvents or gasoline, out of place this far from any road. It was there long enough to make my eyes tingle. Then it dispersed. We exchanged a look, but didn't say much, as if talking about it would make it more real. That was the third ominous thing that day. And looking back, I think it was the moment we started to feel like we weren't just on the mountain. We were being observed on it. By the time the clouds swallowed even the faintest hint of moonlight, our campfire became the only island of visibility in a sea of black. The shadows under the trees pressed in tight around us. We sat close to the flames, roasting s'mores, and half listening to another creepy podcast like idiots, leaning into the vibe, telling ourselves a little fear was part of the fun. My body, on the other hand, wasn't buying it. My shoulders were tight, and every small sound, the shift of a log in the fire, the creak of a tree in the wind, hit me like a warning. Around 9, I remember feeling just loose enough from the beer and just tired enough from the day's hiking that I might have tried to write the weirdness off as my imagination. Then the first bang hit. It sounded like a tree snapping and slamming to the ground somewhere near the river, a deep, resonant thud that we both felt in our chests more than we heard with our ears. The podcast cut off as my hand jerked and hit the pause button. For a moment we just stared at each other, as if checking to make sure we hadn't dreamt it. Then we grabbed our flashlights and swept them toward the direction of the sound. All we could see was the first line of trunks and our own breath hanging in the cold air. No movement, no falling branches, nothing. We waited a few minutes, told ourselves it was probably a dead tree finally giving up, and tried to go back to our normal conversation. but the mood had shifted. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat. The second bang came soon after, louder and from a slightly different direction, farther along the river this time, but still close enough to be too close. It was almost identical in sound, like the same heavy object being dropped again and again. Again, the flashlights revealed nothing but trees and darkness swallowing the beams. The fire felt less comforting now and more like a target, a flare announcing exactly where we were in an otherwise empty valley. Then the third bang, closer, maybe halfway between the river and our campsite. The kind of proximity that makes your body react before your brain does. The woods went perfectly still after it. No wind, no small animal noises, just a ringing absence of sound and two people breathing fast in a circle of light. My dad's eyes were wide in a way I'd rarely seen. The steady, rational man who'd raised me was clearly trying to solve a problem he couldn't immediately name. We agreed without really talking about it to get in the tent, both of us suddenly more interested in being out of sight than figuring out what the noise was. He threw the remaining logs onto the fire to keep it burning high, and we ducked inside the tent with our sleeping bags, our one small camp knife, and our phones. I lay down as flat as I could, trying to make myself smaller, listening to my pulse roar in my ears. That was when the fourth bang came, so close to the campsite that the ground under my spine gave a tiny shudder. It wasn't the kind of earthquake jolt you see in movies. It was subtler, like something massive had hit the earth nearby, or been slammed against one of the big stones that lined the river. My dad, still near the zipper, flinched and froze, staring out into the night. In a low voice, more to himself than to me, he murmured that he could see something, a patch of darkness blacker than everything else, just outside the range of the firelight, like a tall, solid shape standing between the trees. He couldn't make out details, just absence, a silhouette that didn't match any trunk or boulder he knew was out there. I called his name, and he tore his gaze away, zipped the tent closed, and sat with his back against the door, the knife in his hand looking absurdly small against the scale of whatever might be out there. As if the bangs hadn't been enough, another layer of wrongness settled over us, a low, almost inaudible vibration that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. At first I thought it was a truck far off on a highway, a deep, steady hum, but it didn't fade or grow louder. It just hung in the air, creeping under my skin, making my teeth feel like they were buzzing. I realized after a few seconds that I wasn't just hearing it. I was feeling it in my ribs and my throat, like a subsonic note I couldn't escape. Dad whispered, asking if I heard it too, and I nodded even though he couldn't see me. It went on like that for what felt like 5 minutes, though fear stretches time in weird ways. I tried to come up with explanations. Maybe some kind of blasting at an old quarry, maybe machinery in a mine shaft under the ridge, maybe even an approaching thunderstorm reverberating oddly in the valley. None of those thoughts were particularly comforting. Then came the sound that I still have trouble describing. It rose up out of the hum like something pushing through a surface, a thick, guttural noise that didn't sound quite human or animal, more like a damaged voice trying to form a word and failing. It would swell and then choke off, only to start again from a slightly different direction. If you've ever heard a large dog caught mid-growl, or a person sobbing and trying not to make noise, mash those together and lower the pitch. That's as close as I can get. I knew, logically, that it could have been a large animal in distress, a feral hog with an injured throat, or maybe a person drunk or high and trying to scare us. But in that tent, with the walls breathing in and out with my panic, it felt like the mountain itself was trying to speak. I refused to look out the small mesh window inches from my face. The idea of locking eyes with whoever or whatever was making that sound turned my muscles to stone. We lay there, barely breathing, while my dad stayed braced at the zipper, the knife clenched so hard his knuckles must have ached. And then, right in the center of that terror, something stranger happened. My awareness just cut. I don't remember deciding to try to sleep. I don't remember us talking or relaxing. There's a line in my memory where I'm fully awake, heart racing, listening to that noise. And the next frame is me snapping open my eyes, on my back in the middle of the tent, with a knife lying loose near my dad's open hand. For a second, pure panic surged through me, sure that something was standing over us. I grabbed for my phone to check the time, but when I hit the side button, the screen stayed black. It had been nearly full when we went into the tent. Now it was dead. My dad's phone was the same way when I made him check no power at all, like the batteries had been drained or left on for hours, even though we hadn't used them. We stepped outside, both needing to pee and both refusing to go alone, so we stood back to back a few feet from the tent, scanning the tree line. The firewood we'd thrown on before diving inside had burned down to cold ash. The chemical smell was gone. The weird hum had stopped. The valley was so quiet that the little stream we'd heard all day might as well have been a mile away. Somewhere up on the ridge, a single branch snapped, but nothing moved into view. It was still pitch dark. From the feel of the air, it felt like somewhere in the small hours of the morning, that dead time when the night feels deepest. In the thin beam of my dad's backup keychain light, we saw our fourth and final detail of the night that never left me. Just outside the circle where our tent stakes disappeared into the ground, there was a clear boot print in the patchy dirt, big enough that it definitely wasn't mine, positioned as if someone had been standing right at the door listening. Next to it, on the same oak where Wed hung a little lantern earlier, fresh gouges had appeared in the bark, 3 shallow parallel cuts about shoulder height, not deep enough to be from an animal, not wide enough to be from an axe. More like someone had idly dragged a knife down the trunk 3 times while they waited. The wood was still pale and raw. Whoever had been that close to our tent while we lay unconscious, or whatever you want to call it, had been deliberate enough to leave marks. We didn't talk much the rest of that night. We crawled back into the tent, lay there in the dark, and waited for the sky to lighten, counting our breaths, flinching at every rustle. At first light, we packed up in near silence, loaded the car, and drove out of that valley without looking back. Once we were a few miles down the road, where the ridges flattened out a bit and the radio stations came back, we finally started to talk it through. We tried on explanations, like outfits, maybe Wed, inhaled some kind of gas from an old mine opening nearby, or from someone cooking meth in the woods. Maybe the vibrations were heavy equipment in the distance. Maybe the guttural noise was a wounded animal. Maybe the blackout was just our brains protecting us from panic. Maybe the dead phones were a freak coincidence. But the boot print by the door, the fresh gouges at arm's reach, the drag marks Wed seen by the upper loop, and those old missing hikers on the corkboard refused to fit neatly into any of those stories. We told my mom when we got home, and she laughed it off at first, then got that tight look around her eyes when she realized we weren't joking. We haven't camped together since. I still go out on day hikes in the Appalachians. Still love the smell of wet leaves and cold rock and the feeling of standing on a ridge with miles of forest at my feet, but when the sun starts to tilt toward the horizon, I'm back in my car and heading for town. You can call it overreacting if you want. I call it listening to the mountain when it tells you you don't belong there after dark. If you've ever experienced anything remotely like this, a sound you couldn't explain, a gap in your memory, a sign that someone was closer to your camp than you realized, let me know in the comments what you think was really out there that night. Because my dad and I still can't agree on whether we were dealing with nature, a person, or something in between.